politics. It's the philosophy that says your identity as a person is your group identity. You're not an individual, you are a group identity.
Modern Democrats are defined by identity politics. That's the idea that the accident of your birth determines what you're worth, your value.
Look, even if you like identity politics, this kind of thing is antiquated.
I really worry sometimes when I hear criticisms of identity politics, because it's not always clear what is meant by identity politics.
Because you see, for someone like myself who comes out of the Black freedom movement, I've never viewed myself as part of any talk about identity politics. See, Frederick Douglass and Martin King and Fannie Lou Hamer and Ella Baker, they weren't part of identity politics at all.
What identity politics has done is to give people avenues for organizing in ways and with effectiveness that, had it not ever been conceived of, would not have been nearly as possible.
So identity politics can be both a shield and a sword. We've seen these examples before. So what I want to really clarify then is the problem isn't so much with identity politics itself, it's with the way that identity politics is being manipulated. It's being used as a way to advance certain political ideologies.
We have a question we want to ask about what happened to you in 2016 with this Bernie Bros movement, where your followers are seeing they have a racism problem, a misogyny problem. Do you think that's a super PAC thing behind that?
That was the Democratic establishment.
That whole game, that whole identity politics game, that is dangerous beyond belief.
This is Afterwards, and today we're diving into identity politics. What is identity politics? Has identity politics always been around, or is it a new phenomenon? Is it used by the right, by the left, or by both? Does identity politics help our society flourish, or does it lead us towards drag and decay? I'm going to start a little circular. Identity politics is politics around identity, whether that identity be race, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, nationalism, class, etc., etc. It is the organization of society vis-a-vis identity. What are some examples of identity politics in action? Has identity politics changed? Can we escape identity politics? Should we? What is identity politics and what is not identity politics? First, a few words on politics. The word politics comes from the Greek word politika. Ika means things related to, and polis refers to the physical city. According to Aristotle, the polis isn't merely the physical city, it is the actual community of citizens engaged in its governance. Politics is then things related to the community, the city, the states, and how the citizens engage in its governance. Politics determines speed limits, marriage laws, tax policies, who has the power to govern, who can engage in politics to begin with, etc. Politics shapes our rights and ultimately our collective identities. Unlike politics, the word identity has had some changes over time. What started from the etymology of the French word idem, meaning the same, is now used to refer to distinction, uniqueness, and belonging. The ancient Greeks used identity in the logical sense, referring to the unchanging nature of an object or a concept. X is X across time. Even Enlightenment thinkers, such as John Locke, who used the term in the context of personal identity, understood it as a continuity of the self, rather than as a set of distinguishing traits. It was the Romantics who birthed the use of the term identity as individual uniqueness, distinction, and self-expression. I am not made like any of those I have seen. I venture to believe that I am not made like any of those who are in existence. Rousseau posits that identity is found in one's emotions, instincts, and personal experiences. In the state of nature, identity is formed by the need to survive, self-preservation. It is this need to survive that leads humans to act collectively to form the polis. A tribe, including many members who were always ready to give aid to each other and to sacrifice themselves for the common good, would be victorious over most other tribes, and this would be natural selection. Cooperation, as an evolutionary strategy, benefits individuals and is therefore favored by natural selection. However, cooperation is not indiscriminate. It requires clear markers of group membership, who can be trusted, who is an outsider. Evolution may have favored social instincts that reinforced in-group loyalty while maintaining skepticism towards outsiders. Identity is both an evolutionary inheritance and social construct. Once humans form tribes and begin to leave the state of nature, society emerges. A tribe becomes a clan becomes a village, a village becomes a city becomes a state. In society, in a state, survival becomes less and less a daily concern. Although self-preservation remains a driving force, it is no longer all-encompassing. In a fenced community with domesticated animals, crops, division of labor, identity is no longer purely formed by the constant fear of survival. Instead, it is shaped by society's forces, comparison, competition, social hierarchies, who is stronger, who is more intelligent, who is wealthier, who deserves power. Those with power shape the dominant narratives of identity, defining who belongs and who is marginalized. The stronger the social political stakes, the more aggressively identity can be policed. As tribes expand and interact, identity becomes a double-edged sword. It unites an in-group, but it also necessitates the distinction of an out-group. By defining who belongs, we inevitably define who does not. The more different the other is made out to be, the stronger internal unity may become. And this is not only true with regard to in the tribe versus outside the tribe. Within the tribe, there may also be spaces with their own in-groups and out-groups. How all these spaces are created is identity politics. Identity politics is the process by which social groups, defined by race, gender, religion, nation, class, or other markers, mobilize to organize society around those identities. It is not merely the division of space, but the contestation of power within that space. How does identity politics look in practice? Let's look at the US. Jamestown, the first successful English settlement in the Americas. No time to dive deep into its rough early years known as the starving times, but here we have a fascinating story. The story of Pocahontas, the story of 104 men that arrived on May 14, 1607, and by the end of the year, only 34 survived. Unlike some of the other early colonies, for example, Plymouth Colony that was founded by separatist Puritans seeking religious freedom, or Massachusetts Bay Colony founded by, again, Puritans trying to create a religiously pure society, or Rhode Island Colony founded by Roger Williams, who was exiled from the Massachusetts Colony because he wasn't religiously pure enough, or Maryland founded by Lord Baltimore as a Catholic refuge. I think you get the picture. Jamestown's origins were economic. The Virginia Company of London aimed to establish profitable colonies along the eastern coast of the Americas, North America. It was a joint stock venture chartered by King James. It is from this monarch that Jamestown took its name. While profit may have been its primary motive, Jamestown was not immune to the politics of identity. In fact, as the colony struggled to survive and organize itself, identity, particularly religious, cultural, and later racial, became a tool of control, order, and exclusion. In the aftermath of the starving times, the colonies convened the first English Representative Assembly in North America on July 30th, 1619. By then, the population had grown roughly to 1,000, including free Englishmen, a small number of women, indentured servants, and several Africans whose legal status at the time was still ambiguous. The General Assembly was bicameral, consisting of Governor George Yeardley and his appointed council at the top, and 22 elected representatives below them, forming the House of the Burgesses. This was the colonial prototype for what would become the U.S. Congress. George Yeardley was a former London tailor turned military officer who fought in the 80 Years' War, a prolonged conflict between the Dutch and the Spanish, driven by both taxation and religion. The Spanish king, Philip II, viewed suppression of Protestantism as his divine duty, once writing to Pope Pius V, "Rather than suffer the least damage to religion and the service of God, I would lose all my states and 100 lives if I had them, for I do not propose or desire to be the ruler of heretics." Heretics, of course, referring to Protestants. The Dutch, along with its English allies, fought the Spanish back. All to say, Governor Yeardley was no stranger to conflict and division fueled by identity, in this case religion. In fact, as we saw earlier, many colonies were founded as Protestant safe havens. This was in part due to the identitarian religious divide between Catholics and Protestants in Europe at the time. Identity politics via religion. The entanglement of identity and religion was echoed in the laws passed by the First Assembly. Among them, mandatory church attendance, education of indigenous children in Christianity, mandatory corn production, and mulberry tree planting. These laws reflected the Assembly's dual priorities, using religion as a unifying and disciplinary force, and enforcing economic productivity to prevent another starving times. The laws also reveal the early contours of identity politics. Indigenous people were cast as outsiders, their inclusion conditional upon religious conversion and cultural assimilation. The laws offered a pathway in, but only through internal transformation. Notably absent from these early laws is any reference to Africans. Though some Africans were present in Jamestown in 1619, their legal status was undefined, not clearly enslaved nor fully free. This liminal space would soon vanish. Just 1 month after the assembly convened, a ship arrived in Virginia carrying Africans for sale. In the Gospel of Luke, St. John is introduced as crying out these words, first spoken by the prophet Isaiah, "But this ship did not level valleys or raise the lowly. It carried human beings into bondage, cloaked in the name of a prophet who had once called them to freedom."
The São João Bautista departed from the Portuguese port of Luanda, Angola, bound for Veracruz, Mexico, where the Africans on board were to be sold into slavery. En route across the Atlantic, the ship was intercepted by the White Lion, an English privateer sailing under a Dutch letter of marque. After seizing a portion of the human cargo, the White Lion sailed to the English colony of Virginia, where it traded 20 Africans to Governor Yeardley in exchange for food and provisions.
People traded for provisions. As I mentioned before, however, the legal status of Africans was ambiguous at this time. One of the Angolans abroad, Anthony Johnson, was given his freedom after several years of servitude. He became a tobacco planter in Maryland and even had servants of his own. This was not unlike white European indentured servants who served the master for several years and were then given their freedom. Despite his experience, a racial divide was present, a racial divide that would continuously grow. At the passing of Governor Yeardley, he left his heirs, and pardon my language, I am quoting here, his good debts, chattels, servants, cattle, or any other thing. The that Yeardley refers to were likely servants too, but the fact that he lists them as separate to white servants reveals a distinction, at least in his mind, between their status based on race and national origin. The once most powerful man in the land divided his economic property along racial lines, identity politics via race. In 1640, the legal system drew one of its first clear racial lines. John Punch, a black indentured servant, was caught escaping with 2 white servants, Victor and James Gregory. The 2 white servants were sentenced to 7 more years of servitude. Punch was sentenced to servitude for life. But why did skin color begin to define the limits of freedom? Part of the answer lies in the pseudoscientific and teleological ideas that Europeans had carried with them long before arriving in Virginia. Some theologians pointed to the so-called curse theory of Ham, an interpretation of a biblical story in which Noah curses one of his son's descendants, wrongly believed by many to be the ancestors of the African peoples. Others leaned on an ancient and medieval climate theory. Aristotle and later European and North African writers claimed that people born in hot climates, particularly in Africa, were less rational, less civilized, and naturally suited for servitude. These racist myths provided ready-made explanations for why African servants, unlike their European counterparts, could be treated as permanent property. These ideas were not yet law, but they laid the intellectual groundwork for what was to become legal reality. By the 1660s, the economic conditions of the time created a space for racism to grow. As labor demands for tobacco planting grew, the laws adapted to the economic conditions. The law, again, was made to distinguish between white and black servants. In case any English servant shall run away in company with any Negroes, who are incapable of making satisfaction by addition of time, the English so running away in their company shall serve for the time of said Negro's absence. These laws came at a time where not just labor demands were growing, but also a class divide. Indentured servants on the one side, landowners on the other. Indentured servants from both Europe or Africa did not own any land, could not vote or participate in the government assemblies, and even once freed, their voting rights were tethered to property ownership. This stood in stark contrast to Virginia's elite, men like Governor William Berkeley, one of the wealthiest landowners in the colony, who, if not part of the House of Burgesses, could influence the House of Burgesses through economic power. Berkeley's fortune grew in part from the indentured labor system, but also through his grip on trade and his ability to reward allies with land and office. Enter Nathaniel Bacon. Though not as wealthy or entrenched as Berkeley, Bacon was a young aristocrat hungry for more land, more power, more recognition. Basically, he wanted to be able to go out and shoot Indians to be able to expand his land and protect it. At this time, this was only allowed if the House of Burgesses permitted it. Bacon lived in the edges of the English colony, the area where most former indentured servants also lived. Bacon saw an opportunity in the discontent of the poor, conflict with the natives, taxation without representation, and the resentment that class divides often breeds created the political climate to unite the people, the landless disenfranchised, against the political elite. Class-based identity politics. Bacon took advantage of this divide, and he united both white and black indentured servants, or former indentured servants. On June 23, 1676, he marched into Jamestown with several hundred men, demanding that Governor Berkeley give him a legalized private army, political legitimacy, and control over the Indian policy and frontier defense. Being outnumbered, Governor Berkeley initially conceded. However, just a month later, he revoked the commission and branded Bacon a traitor. Bacon then returned and issued the Declaration of the People, decrying, among other things, the rule of the few against the consent of the people. In August of 1676, Bacon's rebellion erupted and burned Jamestown to the ground. By September of 1676, we can only wonder what Jamestown would have been under the leadership of Nathaniel Bacon, but alas, he passed away from illness. Without his leadership, the rebellion disintegrated and Berkeley took back power. Bacon's rebellion gave the elites of the time something to worry about: the unification of the landless via class identity. Their solution? Create division within the landless class among racial lines. By 1680, the Virginia General Assembly passed a law entitled An Act for Preventing Negro Insurrections. As you can guess, there was no white counterpart. This law prevented enslaved blacks from carrying arms or departing from their master's grounds. By 1691, marriage was prohibited between whites and blacks. No longer were the landless whites at the bottom of society. There was now a lower class, the black servants. A class whom the whites could feel superior to and direct their anger towards. The elites fed this anger so that the landless whites would hate their potential class allies rather than the wealthy elite.
By 1705, racial slavery officially became law. All servants imported to the country by sea or by land who were not Christian, Turkish, or Moor were accounted to as slaves. And to make it even more clear, the law specified that Negroes, Indians, even if Christian, Jews, Moors, Muslims, and other, and I quote, infidels, were prohibited from purchasing Christian servants. Identity politics via the law.
Identity politics was present from the inception of the American project. First, perhaps inevitably, by drawing a boundary between colonists and native peoples that helped to reinforce the colonies as a group and eventually began to form a national identity. As the colonies expanded and the plantation system grew, racism and economic exploitation worked hand in hand. Theories of climate and biblical curses gave ideological cover to economic exploitation. A division of society along racial lines, racial slavery. The consequences echoed for centuries and echo to this day. Centuries that witnessed the ideological battle between racial slavery and its own negation, anti-slavery and abolition. A negation that was also present from the beginning and grew as slavery grew and as the economic conditions changed. Anti-slavery and abolition were present at the very moment that racist ideas entered the Western lexicon. It is historically inaccurate to say slavery and racism were a product of their times, therefore people didn't know any better. For starters, I don't think Africans wanted to be enslaved or thought of themselves as subhuman. Even in the ancient world, the moral fault lines were visible, while Aristotle famously declared, "Humanity is divided into two groups, the masters and the slaves, or, if one prefers, the Greeks and the barbarians." Not all Greek thinkers agreed. The sophist Alcidamas countered, "The deity gave liberty to all men, and nature created no one a slave." The same tension appeared in colonial America. In Virginia, while Governor William Berkeley was executing enslaved people who ran away and expanding a legal system that defined Africans as permanent property, up north in Massachusetts, Judge Samuel Sewall was writing, "Let the Negroes and their posterity be free." In 1776, as the nation declared its independence, Southern delegates like Edward Rutledge helped remove Thomas Jefferson's anti-slavery clause from the Declaration of Independence. Yet others, like Quaker preacher John Woolman and free black activist Prince Hall, called for emancipation. Woolman warned that the continuance of this practice is grievous. Hall insisted that the principles of the Revolution applied to Africans as well as Europeans. Jefferson himself, author of the Declaration, embodied both sides. He condemned slavery as a moral depravity in writing, but in practice he enslaved more than 600 Africans. The question was never just what people believed, but what power demanded and what profits required. As I mentioned before, the economic demand for slavery didn't create racism, but it amplified it. It took pre-existing ideas and gave them legal form, political force, and moral cover. It made them a reality. But resistance grew alongside it, from judges to fugitives, from journalists to rebels. The idea of abolition also took shape, and in time, it too gained legal form, political force, and moral clarity. The North did not have the same economic incentives as the South to divide their politics and economy along racial lines. The North was industrialized and relied on wage labor rather than slave labor. Though racist sentiments were present, they were not as backed and fueled by economic factors. Abolitionist ideas were instead given room to flower. Men like William Lloyd Garrison in the North spread abolitionist ideas through the pen, and men like Nat Turner in the South spread abolitionist ideas through the use of force. Nat Turner's rebellion caused the death of 60 people, causing many, including Southern legislators like Thomas Jefferson's grandson, Randall Jefferson, to contemplate the end of slavery. However, the pro-slavery camp prevailed. Instead of abolition, 1832 brought harsher laws that tried to reinforce the racial divide. Black preaching and religious gatherings were banned, fearing that another divinely inspired rebellion might emerge. Teaching enslaved people to read or write was criminalized so that there would never be thoughts of freedom. But the thoughts of freedom continued to grow. In 1838, an escaped slave who had been taught to read and write before the anti-literacy laws were passed started making headway. His name was Frederick Douglass. When Douglass came up north to Boston, he didn't take long to subscribe to Garrison's newspaper, The Liberator. When Garrison first heard Douglass speak, he was so moved that he immediately recruited him to the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society to speak about his experience as a slave and move people towards the abolitionist cause. Still, the North was far from just. Schools were segregated, housing was restricted, and black people were often denied the right to vote. Northern racism shaped even the abolitionist movement. Garrison's organization encouraged Douglass to tell his story, but discouraged him from interpreting it. They wanted him to testify, not theorize. Douglass had other plans, as he later wrote, "I could not always follow the injunction, for I was now reading and thinking. New views of the subject were being presented to my mind. I did not entirely satisfied to merely narrate wrongs. I felt like denouncing them." Though the abolitionist movement was growing in the public spaces of the nation, we could call it politics with a lowercase p, the formal political space, the legislative, executive, judicial branches, were still led by the pro-slavery camp. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 forced Northerners to participate in the recapturing of escaped slaves. 4 years later, the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 opened new territories to slavery by popular vote, creating an unbalance that until then had been an equal number of slave states and free states. Then, in 1857, the Dred Scott decision from the Supreme Court declared that no black person could be a U.S. citizen and that Congress had no authority to ban slavery in any territory, effectively legalizing slavery everywhere. Each law, statute, and ruling marked the deepening entrenchment of slavery within the formal institutions of American power. Those in favor of dividing the polis along racial lines, along racial identity politics, were doing the utmost to hold and expand the racial divisions. Yet even in the face of these setbacks, or perhaps because of them, the abolitionist movement continued to grow. The momentum broke through in 1860 when anti-slavery politics seized the presidency. Abraham Lincoln, the candidate of the newly formed Republican Party, was elected on November 6th. While both Lincoln and the Republican Party began with a position of containment of slavery rather than immediate abolition, Lincoln's victory was alone enough to provoke a crisis. On December 20th, 1860, South Carolina became the first state to secede from the nation, declaring, "A geographical line has been drawn across the Union, and all states north of that line have united in the election of a man whose opinions and purposes are hostile to slavery." The House was divided. Mississippi seceded on January 9, 1861, followed by Florida, January 10th, Alabama, January 11th, Georgia, January 19th, Louisiana, January 26th, and Texas, February 1st. The 7 states formed the core of the original Confederacy. Before Lincoln even took the oath of office in March, during his inaugural address, Lincoln attempted to calm the nation. "I have no purpose, directly or indirectly, to interfere with the institutions of slavery in the United States where it exists." It was to no avail. Following the attack on Fort Sumter in April 1861, 4 more states seceded. Virginia on April 17th, Arkansas May 6th, North Carolina May 20th, and Tennessee June 8th. Together, these 11 states would form the Confederate States of America. The South's war to preserve and expand slavery forced Lincoln's hand. Slavery was not only the backbone of the Southern economy, it was its war engine. Lincoln saw that supporting abolition and emancipation would not only rid the country of the moral wrong of slavery, but it would also give the Union the edge in the war by crippling the South's war machine. In 1863, after months of pressure from those like Douglas and Harrison, Lincoln finally made the war for the North not just about preserving the Union, but also about emancipation and abolishing slavery for good. In the Emancipation Proclamation, Lincoln declared, "All persons held as slaves shall be free, then, thenceforward, and forever free." On April 9, 1865, the Confederacy surrendered. The North had won the war. On December 6, 1865, the 13th Amendment was passed, making slavery illegal in the United States. The politics of racial identity created irreconcilable contradictions. In the South, race became the background for an economic system, a political ideology, and a moral justification, all bound to the institution of slavery. As the United States expanded westward, this racial order sought to expand. But the North, increasingly stirred by abolitionist voices like Garrison and Douglas, began to question the moral cost of slavery. More pragmatically, many feared that the growth of slave states would tip the balance of power, turning the free states into an electoral minority. Still, most Northern leaders sought only to contain slavery, not to end it. It was the South's secession that forced a reckoning. The fight to preserve the Union became inseparable from the fight to abolish slavery, giving the North both a moral cause and political unity. With Union victory, the passage of the 13th Amendment ended racial slavery. But abolition did not uproot the ideology that had sustained slavery. The racial propaganda used to justify bondage lived on, especially in the South. Many white Southerners, having internalized generations of racial hierarchy, now became the torchbearers of a new identity politics, one that demanded division, feared integration, and resisted any vision of equality. Slavery had ended, but the struggle over race and the nation's identity was far from over. Identity politics would continue. The struggle over racial identity and power endured, reshaping itself through the unfinished battles of the Reconstruction, the rise of the Ku Klux Klan, the imposition of Jim Crow, and the long arc of the civil rights movement still to come.